Hello, and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. Today is September 6th, 2024. I'm Marianne Azevedo, and joining me today is TC senior reporter on the Venture Beat, Becca Skutak. Becca, how are you? What's been going on in your world this week?
Oh, dealing with another apartment maintenance issue, but that's a weekly occurrence now. So just happy the weather is not as boiling, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. And I know you've had some interesting stories that we're going to dig into later, so that's going to be fun. Hey, we're also joined by TechCrunch senior editor Devin Coldaway. Devin, what's been going on with you?
I just made my first prints in my dark room. They turned out all right. I'm very glad I put together a little dark room in a spare sort of shed we have out in the sort of yard. And it works. I got it in larger and paper and everything, and it's just as fun as I remember doing it years and years ago. So I'm looking forward to getting back into that as a hobby.
Oh, that's really, really cool. I love photography. I'm definitely an amateur photographer, probably not even as good of an amateur photographer as you are, but I love taking pictures. My family reminds me of it all the time, how annoying I am. But yeah, old school like that with a dark room and actual development and prints. I mean, love it. So you'll have to share some of those prints with us sometime.
I will.
Well, we've got a busy show today. Lots of news, a lot of variety. Deals of the week, we're looking at U.com, Airbase, and Dub Club. For our first theme, we're going to be looking at some disruption in the real estate space. And lastly, we're going to look at venture secondary market SPVs and how they may be an AI bubble of their own. Okay, well, but before we get into the deals of the week, there was something that happened over the holiday weekend that we just have to talk about in case you missed it. So a top court in Brazil ordered this immediate countrywide suspension of X following a months-long legal battle over content moderation. Wow. So I know this has to do with a lot of political stuff, like there was allegations of misinformation. A judge asked for something to happen. X was like, no, we're not going to do it. Anyway, Devin, I know you have thoughts.
Well, I mean, it's kind of like I don't want to have too many thoughts because it's so complex, and I don't know what the political situation on the ground in Brazil and all that kind of thing. Like I've been reading about it, but we've seen this before in like places where there's civil war and unrest. Like I remember writing multiple times about like internet blackouts in Syria and Turkey, but Brazil is a different place with a totally different environment. I think it's really hard to say what the true cause of this is and what the effects will be. So I think it's okay to say like, wow, let's report on the facts and see how this plays out. But there's it's a really complex situation. So I'm interested in reading more, but I'm very wary of saying like, oh well, this will now happen.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know. One thing we do know, though, is that competitor Blue Sky has seen a surge in users after this ban. So, that's kind of an interesting thing. It's benefiting from it. All-time highs, I think a couple of million new users in the past, week or so. So, yeah, we'll have to see how all that plays out. But I want to dig into our deals of the week because I think they were all super, super interesting. Devin, you wrote about U.com, which refocuses from AI search to deeper productivity agents. They just raised $50 million, which in the AI world may not seem like a lot, but I was intrigued. This company seems to be doing really cool things.
Yeah, they're interesting. I've talked with the founder and CEO, Richard Socher, a few times, and he's interested in this sort of like not the big LLM stuff where you need $500 million to even like open the doors on your first day of business. But they are taking on big companies like Google. But as he was talking about, they had this sort of AI search product, which now OpenAI is doing search, Google's getting into search, Microsoft and everything like Bing. Everybody's doing AI search and nobody likes it. So I think he was like, well, maybe we shouldn't do that. And as he pointed out, he was like, well, how do you beat Google? You can't beat Google on a simple question. Like he was all saying like, how old is Barack Obama? Or, how tall is the Space Needle? You don't need a large language model to answer questions like that. And you're never going to beat Google on these simple questions. So don't even bother trying to compete with Google on that stuff. Instead, focus on complex questions that no one would even think to ask Google. Like, how much money should I put into my investment account if I earn, $75,000 a year or whatever? More complex questions that need multiple steps. They might need some like light coding to be done. And what they're building out is something that shows a little more of its work and says, oh, well, I don't know what interest rates are right now, so I'm going to search for that. And then it searches and says, oh, I found that they're 4.5%. So that means you should invest $10,000 a year or whatever. It's interesting and just a little more but deeper questions as a business model thing.
I have a couple of questions for you. I mean, it sounds really intriguing, but how is this different from like some of the other things that are already out there, like with ChatGPT or Claude? I mean, I know that it actually uses some of those models, but does it go even deeper than they do? And also, how does it run less expensively than some of these other companies?
It's tough to say. I asked those specific questions. I'm like, really, how is this better? How is this different? And they do use, like, U.com doesn't have its own big LLM. It has a system for sort of assigning these other LLMs tasks. For instance, Claude is known to be really good on coding tasks. ChatGPT is known to be like quick and knowledgeable on conversational stuff or whatever. These models have different specialties, and knowing what can do what and assigning those tasks is the sort of secret sauce, I think. And also being able to search on their own. Like U.com does do a lot of the sort of searching and parsing of the task and then says, okay, GPT 4.0 is going to look at this image and take the component parts. And then I'm going to put those component parts into Claude, 3 Sonnet or whatever. And that will give me the output for the function that I need. And it's something that it's not just that it's better, but that by taking the strengths of all of these things, you can make a sort of Frankenstein GPT that can do more complex tasks, or at least that's the claim. It's very difficult to test such a, sort of complex thesis, but that's the idea. And they raised $50 million to make it happen. At least they're taking a shot. Yeah.
Yeah, they have 5 times more subscribers now than they did at the start of the year. They're actually making money. They're saying that the unit economics for large enterprise deals are positive, and some companies are using them millions of times per day. So looks like this might be one to watch.
I do think it's not that they're making money. I seriously doubt they're profitable, but they are the enterprise deals. Richard said, we are making money on the big enterprise deals. Mm-hmm. So I think that they can say, look, if we're charging you $100 a seat and at a minimum of 100 seats, and they use the product this much times, we make a profit, which is more than, a lot of AI companies can say. But, if you're just selling an individual license to someone for $10 a month and they use it 500 times, like, you're probably not making any money. So it's certainly not profitable, but I don't think they're aiming at immediate profitability, just saying like, look, we're not in like crazy town throwing money in a hole business status.
Yes, refreshing. Becca, so you wrote about Dub Club, which I love this because it's just different than what we normally talk about. And the headline was, Dub Club wants amateur sports bettors to win more. So what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so Dub Club is essentially a marketplace. So it connects amateur sports bettors with these folks known as cappers. I think usually known as handicappers, but Dub Club calls them cappers. And those are people who are like professionals in the gambling industry who can help people. People will subscribe to these professionals. They'll pay for the content, and with the hope of being able to win more with this additional research from these cappers. I thought this was interesting because I am someone who likes to bet on sports. Not a lot of money before anyone gets concerned. Probably most I've ever bet on something is like $3, but you do lose all the time. You just lose all the time. Even if you think you've got some fun insight you're bringing, even if you think you're like, oh, well, I know this team better. Like, this is my team playing, I'm betting on whatever. You just lose, which is kind of the point of this company, where it's like the sports books are set up for people to lose. The sports books don't make money if people win. So it's like people who are trying to bet, who are trying to win, not necessarily a ton of money or anything like that. But this is just better connecting people to get those quote unquote betting edges so that they can hopefully win more. But the caveat to all of this is, as someone who bets on sports, I would absolutely never pay for this. So it's like, I am very curious about the market size. Sports betting's growing. They've been doing really well. They've had over 1 million subscribers. They didn't need to raise this latest round. They raised 7.5 million. So I think it's interesting in that way, where I'm like, I can see the market here, but it is interesting to cover something where it's like, I technically would be in the target demographic, but I'm not actually sure I would use this.
Well, and they target amateur sports bettors, right? So would you describe it as like true gambling?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Yeah, for sure.
the company downplayed it a little bit in the sense of like, you don't have to worry about amateur sports betting in the same way you worry about things like gambling addiction and things like that, which I don't fully agree with. But in their defense, like they are not, you cannot place bets on this company website. You could, in theory, pay for this content because you were interested in it and not betting at all. So it's like they sit in a weird place in the gambling space overall.
Doesn't it kind of sounds to me like this is sort of like, I know a guy who knows a horse that's a sure thing, bet on Lucky Star in the fourth race 2.0. You know what I mean? But I'm sure it's a little more sophisticated than that. But there must be like stats and everything. So somebody's like, oh, this person is, made this much money in this year, whatever. Like how it feels like once you systematize it, though, you either see that the odds are stacked against you, as you noted, or everybody sees that the handicappers are all scammers themselves and are, they're not making money or something like that. I feel like the cracks will show.
For sure. And this is something that one of the founders and the CEO, Ryan, talked quite a lot about when we were on the phone, in the sense of like, they really vet the people, the cappers they let on the platform, and they have a 3-strike system. So if people are like, hey, like I paid for X capper and they gave me this advice and like it didn't work out at all, and like it didn't seem like they know what they're talking about, they try to immediately like cut people out of the platform. So they're saying like people were doing this prior to Dub Club. Like you would just hit someone up on Twitter or something and they'd send you their Cash App, you'd pay them. They'd send you the advice and stuff, which is like as sketchy as it sounds. And so this is supposed to be a way to protect from that, because they vet when people come on, and they made it very clear, like they're pretty quick to kick people off.
That's cool.
If things seem like not great. Yeah, I think this company will do really well. I am just interested because, as like what I said earlier, it is always interesting talking to a company and being like, yeah, I get this idea, but as someone in the target audience, I'm not sure I would use it. But maybe that means I'm not the target audience. Maybe they're not targeting people who bet $3 on a Denver Nuggets game. So maybe this isn't for me.
Back of the whale.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So my deal of the week, I was a little surprised. It's a company that I've been writing about for years called Airbase, a corporate spend startup, and it is getting acquired by a publicly traded company called Paylocity. This was interesting to me as a fintech nerd because the space that Airbase is in is a really, really competitive one. It's competed with the likes of Brex and Ramp and corporate spend, and it's been around for about 7 years. So the fact that it got acquired was kind of an interesting twist in the drama that has played out over the years in this space, because it's just really highly competitive. Lots of, I don't want to say mudslinging, but lots of, hey, we're better because of this, we're better because of that. And Airbase, one of its claims was that it started out by selling software, where a lot of the other players kind of were focused more like on interchange revenue and then got into selling software later. But did I mention that it sold for $325 million? I don't know if I mentioned that.
It's a lot of money. I mean, this is definitely a space that I don't cover, but I know it's valuable. Everybody wants to use this stuff. You have to if you're a big company, but it's crazy to see these like 9-figure exits for a company where you're like, wait, it's basically just like a ledger or like payment system. Like, aren't there like 100 of those out there? Why would you pay $100 million for any of them? It would, like, you could have gotten a half price deal on whatever their competitors are. But that's obviously a tremendous oversimplification.
No. I mean, I think Airbase was known for having a pretty good product. The software was aimed also, he kind of had a niche target market, mid-sized companies that were seeking to better manage their spending, including things like bill payments, corporate cards, employee reimbursements. It had raised just over $100 million in equity funding, and investors included Menlo Ventures, Bain Capital, First Round Capital. It was valued at about $600 million in 2021. So if you look at that, you might be like, oh, this wasn't a great exit. But keep in mind, 2021 was the peak of the market. Mm-hmm. Very, very few, I'd say, startups, especially in the fintech space, are still valued at what they were necessarily then. Becca, what do you think?
I think the first thing that stood out to me is that they told you how much they were sold for, which is my biggest gripe with acquisitions, because especially, and I will literally tell companies this when they say they won't disclose, that I'm like, then I'm going to assume it's a fire sale because of the current conditions in the market. Like, unless you tell me this is a good acquisition, I am going to have to assume based on the knowledge I have that it's not. So it's like, as you mentioned, of course, this is less than the last round they raised for, but because they are in a space where they do have such strong, large competitors like Ramp and Brex, this is probably a great deal for the company. And
Well,
I
yes.
think this is definitely like I'm glad we're highlighting it. It's worth highlighting. And as always, I've said this on the show, I think before, please tell us how much you were purchased for. We want to know.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
know. It makes a huge difference. And we're going to be much more likely to cover your deal. Before we move on, I do want to note that I did hear from a source that if you count all the cash on Airbase's balance sheet, which does go back to the company shareholders and employees, the entire value of the deal is actually closer to 400 million or a little less than 400 million. And lastly, fun fact, this isn't the first exit for this founder. In 2017, he sold a company called Automatic to SiriusXM for over $100 million. Well, anyway, we've got to jump to break, but when we get back, we'll be talking about some real estate disruption. So stay tuned. All right. So last week, I wrote an article that I don't want to say it went viral, but kind of. It got a lot of attention. And, it's something that I used to be a real estate reporter, and I really enjoy still covering it. And I'm finding as I continue reporting for TechCrunch, people really care about real estate. So one of the things that really was interesting about this story is I heard from Josh Sitzer, who was a plaintiff in a lawsuit against the National Association of Realtors. And it wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a massive landmark lawsuit that ended up really kind of altering the way that commissions are going to be paid out. And it was settled, I think, just earlier this year. The National Association of Realtors agreed to pay like over $400 million in damages. But most interestingly, they also agreed to abolish something called a participation rule that required sell-side agents to make an offer of compensation to buyer brokers. Well, so Josh told me he went after the NAR because he was frustrated, not as a buyer, but as a seller. He's like, why do I have to pay 6% commission to a buyer's agent? This isn't fair. And a lot of people who are buying a home, I've heard, have similar thoughts. They're like, well, I found this house on the internet. I went there and toured it at an open house. I decided I wanted to make an offer. Why does some agent get 6% of the price?
Mhm.
So, he sued. It was a successful suit. And now he co-founded this company called Landian. And Landian aims to help home buyers by offering them flat rates to tour homes and make offers on homes. So it's an interesting concept. It's one of the first I've heard of after this settlement took place. And they're just getting started out. They launched in beta last week. I'll shut up now. Let me be quiet. If y'all have any questions.
You don't need to shut up. I think it's great because it's not about the individual realtors like being greedy or good or bad at their jobs or anything like that. Like, it's a competitive market out there. But I think that just structurally over time, something like, being a realtor or being in realty ends up with these sort of racket-like required fees. Like the fees go up and it's already expensive to buy a home. Home prices are going up. So that means, you would have paid them $15,000 10 years ago. Now you're paying them 25 and you're like, oh my God, add on to how expensive it's already going to be. So I think there was a lot of downward pressure on this industry. And
Mhm.
I feel for the realtors who are, going to have to do more deals and probably hustle harder to keep their income. But it's like if part of that income is from a system that is propping up a sort of exploitative method of making money, which I would feel that it is in a way, then I think that's got to come to an end sometime. And it sounds like it just did in some ways.
Yeah. And as someone who's currently hoping to buy a co-op next year, like just the amount of fees and fines you have to pay to even apply and try to get a home in this current day and age, it is crazy. I mean, I totally hear you, Devin, on the fact that like this is a bummer for the real estate agents themselves who are used to a certain compensation structure that, of course, does affect them. And that totally sucks. But like, it's just crazy. Like I looked at an apartment this week and the apartment was under $3,000, pretty good for like where the location was, etc. And they were like, broker's fee, $4,000. It's like,
Holy
in what
cow.
world am I going to pay you a fee a lot higher than what I'm going to pay? So it's like, I will say regulation in this space is good, but I am glad people are kind of pushing back on these things because I feel like for a long time, people were just like, oh, I just have to pay all of this
Yeah.
extra money that just goes nowhere in my mind. Okay. And it's like, maybe that's not the best way to do it.
Yeah. And I think the startup is emphasizing they're not trying to say real estate agents are dishonest or unethical or anything like that. They're just saying, look, this model may have worked many, many years ago before the internet was around to help people find homes, before things like that. It just doesn't necessarily work in this day and age. So before we move on, I do want to give a little more detail on what the company actually offers. So they offer buyers to pay a la carte, $49 for each home tour and $199 for what they call an offer prep session. Or if you want more handholding, you can cough up a flat fee of $1,799. That includes up to 5 home tours and 2 offer prep sessions. And you only have to pay that if you actually close on a house. Lastly, I will also note that Redfin reached out after this story and they weren't trying to be defensive. They were just simply trying to say, hey, look, we actually see this company as a quote, brother in arms. But they pointed out they're skeptical about this flat fee model. They said they tried to do it in the past. And quote from a spokesperson, when we tried this before in a fiercely competitive housing market, we struggled to win on behalf of customers the offer writing agent hadn't met for listings the agents hadn't seen. We also learned that when customers want to call on the expertise of one person, you have to pay that person very, very well. So they were saying, yeah, they may revisit a flat fee model at some point, but they were saying they were wary. So, I was just surprised at how much reaction this drew from just people in general, realtors, companies like Redfin. It's a hot topic, fun to report on. We'll continue to look at the space.
Can I just say really quick that I think it's interesting when you see sometimes these moves. I was trying to compare this in my head to Uber and taxi drivers, but it's a totally different situation because although there is price differences and stuff, this feels like a move towards better equity between parties and a more competitive market, whereas Uber was coming in like with a totally illegal, unregulated, like massively subsidized, totally fake market that blew taxis out of the water. And that is not what is happening here, unless Landian is somehow like saying, oh yeah, you pay $199, we pay them $12,000 in the background. Like that's not a real business model. And that's basically what Uber did.
Right. Becca, did you have something you wanted to share before we move on?
The only thing I was going to add is Redfin may have came out and said that they consider this company a brother in arms, but it's a tiny startup. The fact that they said anything means that they're worried about it. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Otherwise, they just wouldn't have said anything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I think they were hoping to be included in my original article, but I thought it was worth its own piece. So again, I wasn't taking it as being defensive or anything like that. But when Redfin, as a large company that it is, speaks out, yes, we do find that to be news. So anyway,
it's very much, I'm not mad. Don't put in the paper that I was mad. Energy.
Yeah, don't put in the paper that I was mad.
So the last thing we're going to talk about today, Becca, you wrote this interesting story about how VCs are just so eager to get a piece of AI startups that they're actually starting to buy into each other's SPVs, which are special purpose vehicles, at high prices to do so. I thought this was really interesting. I think not everyone may understand what an SPV is. So do you want to explain that really quickly first?
For sure. So firms raised like traditional funds, maybe it's a flagship fund or a different type of strategy. Special purpose vehicles, these SPVs, are raising specific amount of money for a specific purpose. So that would be, in this case, these are firms raising a specific amount of money for an SPV to back a specific company on the secondaries market. And I'm sure many of our listeners know, but in case they don't, direct secondaries involves buying stakes either from an existing investor or a employee at a company. It's so stakes that have already been issued in the past, and investors are coming in and taking them from whoever owns them at the moment. But what makes this interesting is the reason why people are doing these SPVs is because they want to get into these hot AI companies. It's mainly AI companies. I mean, we talk about how the rise of venture secondaries has been crazy this year, but if you talk to anyone who plays in the space, it's like, other than SpaceX, it's all pretty much AI companies is where the activity is. So they're raising this extra money so they can get in on the cap tables. That's totally normal. That's been a part of secondaries forever. People have always done that. But the interesting piece, that new news here, is that these VCs who raise these SPVs, they buy stakes on the cap tables, are now selling stakes in the SPV to other VCs who essentially become LPs in the fund. They don't actually own any part of the stake of the AI company that the SPV is backing. They are just the same structure as if CalPERS backs a fund, and then the fund goes and backs a company. But the reason they're doing this, like why would they just not, try to buy secondary stakes in the company themselves, is because there's access control for these secondary stakes. Companies are usually pretty strict of who can buy them. They only approve certain people. So these are the VCs who cannot get in. This is the only way they can get in, and they're willing to pay a huge premium to get into these SPVs.
So this is a ignorant question, but is there any overlap between this and the kind of like derivatives trading and like risk management that you see in the financial world, where it's like I'm reducing my risk by selling on my high risk items to other people at a inflated price or something like that? I feel like this gives the owners of on the cap table a little play in their position, because if they are selling on part of their stake at 30%, they're basically passing on that risk to another stage of investment. And that gives them some play, but it's an increased risk for the people who are paying more for what the original owner has deemed essentially a risky bet.
The first word that came to my mind when hearing this is FOMO. It's all about FOMO, right? Mm-hmm. Like, so scared of missing out that they're willing to take these big bets and pay these higher premiums. That's what it feels like.
Yeah. And the thing that I think is interesting to note too, which I didn't get into too much into this piece, but I probably should have, is that these investors who have the SPVs, so the people who are actually buying an actual stake on the cap table, are already paying a pretty inflated valuation for the most part, just because these companies are trading really highly on the secondaries market right now. I know I just covered last week people talking about how this rumored deal with OpenAI, like, can they really raise at an above 100 billion valuation? You look on the secondary market, people are bidding above that valuation literally like every week. So yes, people are willing to pay these crazy prices. So then these VCs that buy into another VC's SPV paying at even a higher premium really does put them in a weird risk position, because I wrote a piece earlier this year that talked about how, due to certain investment clauses, investors have a pretty strong say in whether or not one of their portfolio companies goes public or not. And so part of the reason why we haven't seen many IPOs, per some sources I spoke to at the time, was that these investors were blocking potential IPOs because they didn't want to lose money. But this is where it gets interesting. If a VC who is actually on the cap table may approve an IPO of one of these said underlying companies where they make money, but the people who backed their SPV at a premium will not. So if you buy at these huge premiums, of course, the company has to exit at whatever amount you paid for just to break even, which this is obviously not an environment where people are trying to break even. They're trying to make these huge home run returns. So it just seems like a space that I just do not know how long this trend will be able to last, because people are just taking on a lot of risk at a time when the venture asset class is not really producing good returns for their LPs. Like, you kind of wonder when the music stops. But hey, maybe some of them will end up being wildly successful. That is, of course, possible as well.
The other word that pops to mind is bubble.
Yes.
The word that popped in my mind was Beanie Babies. Well, it's like selling, partial Beanie Baby shares, where it's like, look, I've got the Bonky the donkey, and you can this is obviously going to sell for like $4,000 in a couple of years, so but you can buy into it at $3,000 even though I bought it at $2,000. I mean, this is the tale as old as time in business, right? And it does feel a little bubblish, but you just hope that you get off of the ride before the music stops, like you said. And maybe that's tomorrow, maybe it's in 5 years. Like, people can make a lot of money even in 24 hours. I understand the impulse, but it is starting to look a little desperate.
Yeah, just a little bit. We're going to have to leave it there. This has been another fun episode. I feel like we've had so much fun that the time is flying by. We could go on for like another 30 minutes, but we will be back next week though. Until then, you can find Equity under the handle at EquityPod on X and Threads. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye. Equity is produced by Teresa Loconsolo with editing by Kel. Bryce Durbin is our illustrator, and we'd like to give a big thanks to our audience development team and Henry Pickavett, who manages TechCrunch audio products. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.